The woman who rode into Harlan Creek on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878 did not look like someone who had anything left to lose. And that, more than anything else, was what made Gideon Covington set down his fence post and stare. She came in from the eastern road, the one that wound through the red dust flats and the scrubby juniper breaks, a road that most travelers avoided because it was long and hard, and offered nothing in the way of shade or water for the better part of 20 miles. Her horse was a gray mare with a notched ear, sturdy but tired, foam gathered at the corners of the animal's mouth and legs coated to the knee in the pale rust-colored dust of the flats. The woman herself sat straight in the saddle, the kind of straight that does not come naturally but is learned through necessity, through long miles and longer days and the refusal to let anyone see you slump. She wore a brown riding coat that had been good once, a wide-brimmed hat that sat low against the morning glare, and beneath the shadow of that hat, running from just below her left cheekbone to the edge of her chin, there was a scar. It was not fresh, not a wound still healing, but it was not so old either that it had fully faded into the pale silver of old scars. It was somewhere in between, the color of new rope, clean and deliberate looking, a line drawn across her jaw as though someone had meant for it to be there, meant for it to be the first thing a person noticed. Gideon noticed it. He noticed it, and he noticed the way she held the reins, loose and easy, the way a woman holds reins when she has been riding so long that the horse and her hands have reached some private agreement. He noticed the way she looked down the main street of Harlan Creek without any expression of relief, no softening around the eyes that people usually showed when they finally reached a town after crossing the flats. She looked at the town the way a person looks at something they intend to deal with. He was standing on the south side of his property line, where his land met the edge of the town proper, mending the split-rail fence that old Terrence Blunt's cattle had knocked through for the third time that month. He had his sleeves rolled, a leather-work glove on one hand and none on the other because he had lost the second glove somewhere in the grass and had not bothered to go back for it. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled a little when it grew too long, which it currently was. He had a rancher's face, weathered and direct, with eyes that were a shade of brown so dark they looked black in certain lights. He was, by any measure, a man who belonged exactly where he was standing. He watched the woman ride past and then watched the gray mare stop outside the land registry office, which was also the post office and also, on certain days of the week, served as the office of the county assessor. The woman swung down from the saddle without any of the stiffness that a long ride usually produces, which told him she had taken breaks, had been smart about the journey even if it had been brutal. She tied the mare to the post, patted the animal's neck once, briefly, with real affection, and then reached down and pulled off her right boot. Gideon blinked. He was not a man given to gawking, had been raised better than that, but he was also a man of honest instincts, and his honest instinct right now was to keep watching because something about this woman suggested she was worth watching. She reached into the boot and drew out a folded piece of paper, which she shook straight and examined briefly in the morning light before folding it once more and tucking it under her arm. She put the boot back on with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before, straightened her coat, pushed her hat back slightly on her head so that the scar caught the full sun for just a moment, and walked into the registry office. He stood there with his fence post in his hand for a long moment after she disappeared through the door. Then he set the post down in the dirt, pulled off his remaining work glove, tucked it in his belt, and walked across to the registry office. He told himself it was because he had meant to stop in and ask Walt Greer about the water rights survey that had been pending since February. He told himself that honestly, and mostly he believed it. Walt Greer's office was small and smelled of old paper and tobacco, and the particular dusty warmth of rooms that have been closed for long stretches of cold weather, and are only now being coaxed back to life by the advancing spring. There were stacks of ledgers on every flat surface, and a map of the county tacked to the wall behind Walt's desk that had been updated so many times in so many different hands that it was more patched than original at this point. Walt himself was behind the desk, a man of 60 with white side whiskers and spectacles that he was always pushing up his nose, and he was looking at the woman with the careful, professionally neutral expression that meant he was trying very hard not to look surprised. The woman had placed the paper from her boot on the desk and was smoothing it flat with both hands. She had her hat off now, held in her left hand, and her dark hair was pinned up in a practical arrangement that had come somewhat loose from the ride. The scar was fully visible. She was, Gideon realized when he could see her face properly, younger than he had initially thought. Somewhere around 25, maybe 26, with dark eyes and a quality of stillness that reminded him of the way certain horses looked when they were paying very close attention to everything around them. "I am Josephine Hayes," she said to Walt, in a voice that was clear and even and carried the slight formality of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times and is not going to let it be taken from her. "I have a deed to the parcel on the east ridge above Harlan Creek. 160 acres, filed under the name of my father, Samuel Hayes, deceased this past November. I am his sole heir and I intend to register my claim." Walt pushed his spectacles up and bent over the paper. Gideon stepped inside the door and closed it behind him and stood to one side, not wanting to interrupt. Josephine Hayes did not look at him. She was focused entirely on Walt. "Miss Hayes," Walt began, and the particular quality of that beginning made Gideon's jaw tighten a little because he recognized it. That specific way of beginning a sentence when you were about to tell a woman something you would not bother telling a man, or would tell differently if you did. This is a homestead claim, filed in 1874, which means the residency requirement." "My father fulfilled the residency requirement," Josephine said. "He lived on the parcel from the summer of 1874 until he died last autumn. I have a letter from his neighbor, a Mr. Aldous Fenn, attesting to that fact. I also have a copy of the original land notice from the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne." She reached into her coat and produced 2 more folded papers with the composed efficiency of a woman who has prepared for every objection. "I am his heir. The land passes to me. I am asking you to record that transfer." Walt was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers. Gideon could see the man turning over whatever he was going to say next, weighing it, and he cleared his throat gently from near the door. Walt looked up. Josephine Hayes looked up too, for the first time, and her dark eyes met Gideon's and held there for exactly one moment before she looked back at Walt with an expression that communicated clearly she was not going to be distracted. "Morning, Walt," Gideon said. "Just stopped in about the water rights survey, but it can wait." He kept his voice easy and friendly, the particular tone he used when he was trying to settle a situation without making anyone feel managed. Walt seemed somehow to relax slightly. He looked back at Josephine's papers. "I will need to verify the chain of title," he said, and this time it was a professional statement rather than an evasion. "It will take a few days." I can wait," Josephine said. "I understand the process." She paused and then said with a very slight adjustment in tone that was not softer exactly but was more direct, "I would like a receipt acknowledging that I have submitted these documents today." Walt wrote out a receipt. Josephine took it, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. She gathered the other papers, folded them with precise care, and tucked them back under her arm. She picked up her hat. Then she turned and faced the room fully for the first time and found Gideon still standing near the door. He moved aside so she could pass. She paused a foot from him, not alarmed but assessing, the way a person pauses when they are deciding whether something is worth their attention. "Thank you," she said. It was not entirely clear what she was thanking him for. The small clearing of his throat had perhaps communicated more than he had intended. "Gideon Covington," he said, and put out his hand. "I run the Covington Ranch. My land meets the east side of the Harlan Creek parcel." She looked at his hand and then took it and shook it once firmly. Her grip was a working person's grip. "Then we are neighbors," she said. "Looks that way," he agreed. She walked out of the office. He turned back to find Walt watching him with a look that mixed curiosity and something faintly like amusement. Gideon ignored the look, asked his question about the water rights survey, received a vague answer that meant nothing had moved since February, and went back to his fence. He could still see the gray mare tied outside the registry office when he got back to where he had been working. He picked up his fence post and resumed what he had been doing, but the work went slower than usual because his mind was somewhere else entirely. Harlan Creek was a town of roughly 400 people in 1878, sitting in the dry foothills of southeastern Wyoming, and it had the particular social ecology of all small western towns, which meant that everyone knew something about everyone, and most people thought they knew more than they actually did. By that evening, the fact that a woman named Hayes had ridden in and filed a claim on the East Ridge parcel had traveled through 2 saloons, the general store, the livery stable, and the church sewing circle, which met on Tuesday afternoons and had therefore been perfectly positioned to receive and distribute the information. Josephine Hayes, for her part, had taken a room at Marta Voss's boarding house on the north end of the main street. Marta Voss was a German-born widow of 50 who ran a clean, firm establishment and whose primary rule, beyond the payment of rent on time and the removal of boots in the front hall, was that she did not ask questions, and she did not permit others to ask them on her premises. This made her boarding house the preferred choice of anyone in Harlan Creek who valued their privacy, which was why Josephine had gone directly there. Gideon ate his supper alone that evening, as he usually did, in the kitchen of the large house he had inherited along with the ranch when his father passed 3 years earlier. The house was good-sized, built for a family that had never fully materialized, with 4 bedrooms that were mostly empty and a kitchen that Gideon kept well-stocked because cooking was one of the things he genuinely enjoyed when he had the time for it. He made cornbread and beans and fried salt pork and ate at the big oak table in the kitchen, and he thought about the East Ridge parcel. He knew it well. He had ridden along its boundary lines many times over the years and had spent one season trying to negotiate its purchase from the land office when it had seemed like the previous claimant had abandoned it. That had gone nowhere, and then he had heard that a man named Hayes had filed on it and was building up there, and he had left it alone. The parcel was good land, rough in places, but with a reliable water source in Carver Creek and good grass on the upper ridge. It was adjacent to his own southeastern pastures, where he ran about 60 head of mixed cattle. He was not thinking about the land for business reasons. He knew that and was honest enough with himself to admit it. He was thinking about the woman who had walked into Walt Greer's office with a deed pulled from her boot, and a voice that did not waver, and the scar along her jaw that she carried without apology, and the way she had shaken his hand once firmly, and told him they were neighbors. He thought about that quite a bit. The next morning he was up before 5, as usual, and out in the barn by the time the sky was shifting from black to the deep purple that preceded dawn in this part of Wyoming. He had 3 ranch hands who worked for him. Tamaz, who had been with him for 5 years and who was the most competent horseman Gideon had ever met, Elias, who was 20 and learning fast, and old Pete, who had worked the ranch since Gideon's father's time and who mostly handled the garden and the smokehouse now, but who could still ride when needed. Tamaz and Elias slept in the bunkhouse. Pete had a room in the house because his joints had gotten bad enough over the winter that the cold in the bunkhouse was cruel to him, and Gideon had simply moved him inside without making any particular mention of it. He saddled his horse, a big bay gelding named Roper, and rode out to check the southeastern pasture fence. It was the honest reason and also, he acknowledged to himself, the convenient one, since the southeastern pasture was the one that bordered the East Ridge parcel. He told himself he was simply doing his work. He found the gray mare before he found her. The horse was grazing along the creek bed that marked the lower boundary of the parcel. Reins looped over the saddle horn, free to move, but choosing to stay near the water. He stopped Roper and looked up the ridge and found Josephine Hayes about halfway up the slope, on foot, walking a line that he recognized as a property boundary survey. She had a piece of paper in her hand and was comparing it to the landscape, stopping occasionally to check the position of old survey stakes that her father had apparently driven along the line. He rode toward the creek and crossed it and came up the slope at an angle that would not bring him directly at her from behind, the way you approach any person in open country when you do not want to startle them. She heard his horse and turned before he was close, watched him come with her hand resting at her side near but not on the pistol she wore on her right hip. He was glad to see the pistol. A woman alone on open land in 1878 had no business being without one. He stopped Roper a polite distance away and tipped his hat. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said, and lowered her hand from near the pistol. "I was checking my southern fence," he said, which was true. "Noticed your horse." She looked back at her paper and then at the ridge above her. "I am trying to find where the northeast corner stake is supposed to be. The description in the deed says 40 chains northeast from the creek bend, but I cannot locate the stake." He looked up the ridge, orienting himself. "There is a big split-top pine up near the top of the ridge," he said. "Your father used it as a witness tree. The stake should be about 30 yards south-southwest of it." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I walked this boundary 4 years ago," he said, "when I was trying to buy it." "Your father had already filed before my offer went through." He paused. "I am glad he did, as it turned out. It is better land than I appreciated at the time." She was quiet for a moment, assessing this. "You were trying to buy it." "I was," he confirmed. "I am not anymore. It is your land, Miss Hayes, if the registry confirms the transfer, and from what I saw you had your paperwork in order." "I have had it in order for 3 months," she said, and there was the first suggestion of something raw under the even surface of her voice. "The land office in Cheyenne kept finding reasons to delay. The first was that I did not have the death certificate properly notarized. The second was that the chain of title required additional documentation. The third was," she stopped herself. "The point is I am here now." "You rode from Cheyenne," he said. "From Douglas," she said. "I came by rail from Cheyenne to Douglas and then rode from there." Douglas was about 60 miles east, the eastern road through the flats. He understood now why she had looked at Harlan Creek without relief when she arrived. She had been fighting for this for 3 months before she ever got on a horse. "That is a hard road in April," he said. "It is not a hard road," she said, in a tone that closed that subject with finality. "It is simply a road." He almost smiled but held it back. "What are you planning to do with the parcel?" She turned back to the ridge and began walking upward again. He rode alongside, which she did not object to. "My father had a cabin and a small herd of about 30 cattle," she said. "I intend to see what condition the cabin is in, assess the herd, and build it into something worth having. I know ranching." She said the last sentence as though she expected him to dispute it. "I did not suggest otherwise," he said mildly. She glanced at him sideways. The morning light was full now, coming at a low angle across the ridge, and it lit up the scar along her jaw without hiding it. He did not look away from it or pretend not to see it. He simply looked at her the way he looked at anything, directly and without excess commentary. They found the split-top pine. The stake was exactly where he had said it would be, driven deep in the rocky soil with a white rag tied around the top that had gone gray with weather. She crouched beside it and made a note on her paper, then looked up at him where he sat on Roper. "Thank you," she said. "Do you have someone helping you with the cabin?" he asked. "I will manage," she said. "I did not ask if you could manage," he said. "I asked if you had someone helping you." She straightened and looked at him for a longer moment than before, the kind of look that was doing real measuring, gauging whether he was offering out of honest neighborliness or some other motive that she would need to decide how to handle. He held still under that look and let her take her time with it because it was a fair thing, a wise thing. for a woman alone in a new place to look carefully at the men around her. "No," she said, "I do not have anyone helping me." "I can spare Elias for a day or two," he said. "He is good with structural repairs. Cabin likely needs the roof checked and the chimney cleared if it has been sitting empty since last fall." She looked at him another moment. "What do you want for it?" she said plainly. He liked that she asked directly. "Nothing," he said. "I want for you to have a sound roof over your head, because a neighbor with a bad roof is a neighbor I am going to spend the rest of the season worrying about, and I have enough to worry about." That almost got a smile out of her. Not quite, but almost. The corner of her mouth moved and her eyes changed slightly, warmer and more open for just that half-second before she pulled them back to neutral. "All right," she said. "I would be grateful for the help." He said he would send Elias up the next morning, and rode back down to check his fence. He was aware, when he was back on his side of the creek, that she had gone back to walking her boundary lines, and he was aware of precisely how long he sat on Roper at the crossing before he turned the horse away and moved on. Long enough. The cabin on the East Ridge parcel was in better shape than either of them had expected. Samuel Hayes had been a careful man, it turned out, a man who valued what he had built and maintained it accordingly. The roof had one section near the north eave that needed new shingles, which Elias handled in the better part of a morning. The chimney had a bird's nest in it, which Elias cleared, and the front step had rotted through on one side, which he replaced with timber that Josephine had already located and brought down from the tree line above the cabin. The interior was dusty but intact, a single large room with a sleeping loft, a good iron stove, 2 chairs and a table, a wide shelf of tools along the south wall, and in the corner a wooden crate of personal belongings that Josephine's father had left, and that Josephine went through quietly and alone while Elias was occupied with the roof. Gideon came up in the afternoon, after his own morning work was done, carrying a sack of flour and salt pork and dried beans, enough for a week, which he set on the table without ceremony or explanation, and then went to look at the fence line at the back of the property that Elias had mentioned in passing was in poor repair. It was. He spent an hour on it while Josephine watched from the cabin door for a while, and then came and helped without being asked, and they worked side by side in the easy silence of 2 people who are accustomed to physical work and do not need to fill it with conversation. When they stopped in the late afternoon and Elias had ridden back down to the Covington ranch, Josephine made coffee on the iron stove, and they sat in the 2 chairs at the table and Gideon asked about her father. She told him in the same clear, even tone she used for most things. Samuel Hayes had been a quiet man, a former schoolteacher from Ohio who had come west in his 50s looking for something he could not have named precisely, and had found, in this particular ridge above this particular creek, what he was looking for. He had been 61 when he filed his homestead claim and had spent 4 years building it into something real slowly, as old men do things, but steadily. He had died of pneumonia in November without warning, without suffering much, which she said is something to be grateful for. She had been in Laramie when it happened, working as a bookkeeper for a freight company, and had received the letter from Aldous Fenn 10 days after her father was already in the ground. "I am sorry," Gideon said. "He was a good man," she said, and took a sip of her coffee. It was matter of fact rather than cold, the way some people grieve by stating facts about the person they loved. "And you," he said, "you were in Laramie before this." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Before Laramie I was in Cheyenne, before that Denver, before that Abilene." She said it as though it was a list of places on a map rather than the history of a life, but he heard it as the latter. "That is a lot of moving," he said. "It is what women do when they do not have land of their own," she said. He thought about that for a moment. It was a true thing, a hard true thing, the kind of observation that had the weight of several years' experience behind it. He thought about what it meant to move from city to city, working as a bookkeeper for whoever would hire you, carrying your whole life in a saddlebag and your father's deed in your boot because it was safer there than anywhere else. "You are not moving anymore," he said. It was a simple statement. He had not intended it to be anything more than that, but when she looked at him across the table in the low, late afternoon light coming through the cabin's single window, it landed as more. He saw it land, saw the way her expression did something complex and quick that she managed before it fully formed, and he thought he had said too much too soon and was ready to walk it back. But she said, "No. I am not moving anymore." And the way she said it was like a door being closed against all the cold and the wind and the long roads, and it had nothing of sadness in it, only the sound of someone deciding something. In the weeks that followed, Harlan Creek settled into its relationship with Josephine Hayes the way small towns always settle into their relationships with newcomers, which is to say gradually, skeptically, and with a great deal of discussion that the newcomer is not present for. The women of the church sewing circle, which was also the primary social organ of the town's middle class, had several opinions. Clara Watkins, who was the minister's wife and whose opinions carried the greatest institutional weight, said she seemed respectable but reserved. Ada Prout, who ran the dry goods section of the general store, said she paid cash for everything and never tried to bargain, which Ada considered a mark of good character. Old Ruth Calloway, who was 81 and had been in the territory since before it was a territory, said the scar on the girl's jaw told her the girl had survived something, and surviving something was the only qualification that mattered out here. There was also, inevitably, the question of her claim. The East Ridge parcel had been of interest to more people than just Gideon Covington. Harlan Rusk, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, the Bar 7 brand with nearly 800 head, had been eyeing the East Ridge for its water access. Carver Creek was one of the few year-round water sources on the eastern side of the valley, and Rusk's eastern pastures ran dry in August and September if the summer was hard. He had been under the impression that the Hayes parcel would revert to the federal land office upon old Samuel's death, and he had been making arrangements to file on it himself. When Walt Greer's registry recorded the transfer to Josephine Hayes on the 14th of April, Rusk was unhappy in the particular way of a man who had counted a thing as his before it was his, and now found he had been counting wrongly. Gideon was aware of Rusk's feelings about the matter because Harlan Creek was 400 people, and the awareness of things spread through it like water through dry ground. He did not consider it his business to warn Josephine. She was, he had already established, a woman of considerable practical intelligence, and she would see what was there to see. He also did not consider it his business to fight her battles before they existed. He did, however, find himself riding up to the East Ridge parcel on Saturday afternoons after his own week's work was done, ostensibly to check the shared fence line and see how the repairs were holding. It became a habit so naturally that he almost did not notice it becoming one. He noticed the moment when Josephine began to expect him, which was a Saturday in late April when she had coffee ready before he arrived. He noticed it and was glad of it in a way that sat warm and quiet somewhere behind his ribs. They talked, those Saturday afternoons, in the way that people talk when they are paying attention to each other without yet admitting it. She told him about the cattle 14 head remained on the parcel, a mixed bunch her father had accumulated, and he talked her through what he knew about the local market, the railroad schedules out of Cheyenne, the best buyers. She was quick to understand anything said once and did not require it said twice, and she had questions that showed she had already been thinking about the same things. He found himself looking forward to the questions. She was not easy to know. That was the honest truth of it. She had a quality of careful guardedness that was not unfriendly but was particular, the way a person is when they have learned that being easy to know is also being easy to take advantage of. She was generous with information, with practical help, with the sharp, useful observations she made about everything around her, but she was slow with anything personal. The scar he did not ask about. He waited, understanding without being told that it was hers to share if she chose, and that choosing when and whether to share it was one of the few private things that she had full control over. He asked about it in early May, but not the way he had planned to, not at a considered moment. It came out simply and naturally, the way things do when you have been sitting with someone for long enough that the formal edges come off. They were mending a section of fence on the north side of her pasture, both of them on foot, working along the line together. It was a warm day and she had pushed her hat back and was working with her sleeves rolled, and the evening light was long and golden across the grass. She reached up to push a strand of hair back from her face, and the movement caught the scar in full light, and he looked at it, and she saw him look. And instead of looking away as he might have on any previous occasion, he said, quietly and without any of the edge that a rude question would have, "That looks like it happened in a mean way." She kept working for a moment. He waited. "It did," she said. A long pause. He handed her the wire stretcher. "A man in Denver," she said, clipping the words short. "I was 19. I worked in a hotel. He did not take well to being told no." She paused again. "I told him no rather loudly and with a great deal of specificity, and he took it even less well at that point." "Did anyone?" he started. "No," she said, which answered every version of that question. He was quiet for a while. He felt the old, hot, familiar anger that he always felt when he encountered the ways the world used its indifference against the people who most needed its protection. But he kept it off his face and out of his voice because she was not telling him this to be comforted, and she was not telling him so he could be angry on her behalf. She was telling him because he had asked and she had decided he was worth telling. "You were 19, he said. "Yes." "And you handled it yourself?" "Yes." She looked at him sideways. "Do not make it heroic. I survived, that is all." "That is not all," he said quietly, and then let it alone. She was quiet for a long time after that, and they worked in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, closer and more real, with some of the air between them changed in a way that was not uncomfortable but was significant. At the end of May, Harlan Rusk came to call. Josephine told Gideon about it the following Saturday with the composed brevity she used when she was handling something that could easily become more inflamed than she intended to let it. "He came with 2 of his men," she said. "He was polite. He offered to buy the parcel for a fair price," he said. The price he offered was $200 for 160 acres with a year-round water source and a built cabin. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "I told him I was not interested in selling." "How did he take that?" Gideon said, although he already had a general sense. "He said he hoped I would reconsider," she said. "He said it the way men say things when they mean something else. He said ranching was hard work for anyone, but particularly for a woman alone, and that I ought to think seriously about whether this was the life I truly wanted." Gideon set his coffee mug down. "And you said?" For the first time in his experience of her, Josephine Hayes smiled fully, completely, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face in a way that caught him entirely off guard, warm and quick and with a humor in it that was both sharp and genuine. "I told him that hard work and I were old friends," she said, "and that I was comfortable with my decision." The smile faded to something smaller but stayed. He was not pleased. "No," Gideon agreed. "He would not be." "I also told him," she said, and her voice was even again, "that if he sent his men onto my land without invitation, I would notify the county sheriff, and then I would notify him personally in that order, and that he should consider both conversations carefully before he arranged either." Gideon looked at her for a moment. Then he said, with complete sincerity, "Josephine Hayes, I think you are the most formidably sensible person I have ever met." She looked at him, surprised by the plainness of it. People complimented her sometimes, but not like that. Not with that particular combination of admiration and genuine regard, and not using her full name in that way, as though it meant something to say it. "I am practical," she said, but her voice was softer than she intended. "You are practical," he agreed. "You are also brave, which is different. You are brave in the way that does not look like bravery from the outside." She looked down at her coffee. The late afternoon light was coming through the cabin window again, that low amber light that had become, without her quite realizing it, one of the things she associated with this particular space and this particular man sitting across the table from her. She had spent years being careful, and she had been right to be careful, and she knew this man for only 7 weeks, which was not a long time, and she was a person who had learned through experience that a warm feeling about a man was not sufficient reason for trust. All of that was true. And also, sitting there in the warm light of her own cabin, which she had cleaned and repaired and made into something that was genuinely hers, looking at Gideon Covington, who had sent his hand to help with her roof and brought flour without making a performance of it, and walked her boundary lines, and listened to her talk about market prices, and never once suggested by word or manner that she ought to want something different than what she wanted. She was aware that the careful distance she maintained was beginning to feel less like wisdom and more like habit. She looked up. He was watching her with that direct, quiet attention of his, not pushing, not waiting for anything in particular, just present. "You have been very kind to me," she said, and it came out more vulnerable than she meant it to. "I have been neighborly," he said. "There is a difference," she said. "Yes," he said, "there is." The silence between them was warm and full, and held a great deal that neither of them had said yet, and both of them knew it, and neither of them were quite ready to say it, and that was all right. Some things needed their right moment, and both of them were people who understood patience. He rode home in the last of the light with a feeling in his chest that he recognized from a long time ago, from before his father died, and the ranch became everything, from when he had been a younger man who believed in the uncomplicated future. He had not felt it in some years, and it was, he thought, the best possible proof that some things could come back to life if you gave them the right conditions. June came warm and dry, and the cattle on both properties moved to the upper pastures where the grass was still green. Josephine bought 4 additional head at the auction in town, bringing her herd to 18, and Gideon sat next to her at the auction barn and answered the questions she had about the individual animals in the same practical, unpatronizing way he answered everything, and the auctioneer's assistant, a young man who did not know either of them, watched the way they leaned together over the sale papers and made his own private assumptions about their relationship with the kind of confidence that only comes from being completely wrong. After the auction they had supper at the Elkhorn restaurant on the main street, which was not a saloon and served proper meals and was therefore appropriate, and they sat across from each other at a corner table and talked for 2 hours, not about cattle or fences or water rights. They talked about the books they had read, which turned out to be an unexpectedly rich subject. He had been educated at home by his mother, who had been a schoolteacher from Virginia and had a particular fondness for history. Josephine had been educated by her father, who had been an actual schoolteacher, and had therefore been given access to a broader library than most people in this part of the world, and had read everything in it. They argued amiably about whether Ulysses Grant's memoir, published 2 years earlier, was as honest as it purported to be. They found that they had both read the same history of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and had both been more interested in the role of Sacagawea than the academic text had seemed to think warranted. He told her about a summer he had spent as a young man in Colorado before he came back to take over the ranch, and she listened the way she listened to everything completely without interrupting. He walked her back to Marta Voss's boarding house after supper. She was still sleeping there several nights a week while she made the cabin fully habitable, and they stood on the front step in the warm June dark for a moment. "That was a very good evening," she said. "It was," he agreed. She looked at him. The town was quiet at this hour, just the distant sound from the saloon down the street and the low conversation of crickets in the vacant lot beside the boarding house. "You should come for supper at the cabin," she said. "Next week. I want to try the stove. It has been behaving well, but I have not tested it with anything ambitious." "I will come," he said. Then he said, because he was a man who believed in the honest statement when the honest statement was required, "Josephine, I want you to know that I am not being your neighbor out of any." He stopped, choosing words carefully. "I want to be honest with you." She waited. "I like you," he said, and it was simple and clear and entirely real. "I like talking to you, and I like working alongside you, and I think about you when I am not doing either of those things. I'm not asking you to do anything with that information right now. He paused. "I thought you deserved to know it rather than have me be indirect about it." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he normally was not. "I appreciate that," she said finally. "More than you probably know." She paused. It is not easy for me too." She looked away from him briefly and then back. "I find that I think about you too," she said, and it came out precisely and deliberately, like something chosen from among several options, and it was possibly the bravest thing she had said in his presence, which for a woman who had looked Harlan Rusk in the face and told him where to put his offer, was saying something considerable. He felt the warmth behind his ribs expand into something larger. "All right," he said quietly. "That is enough for now." She smiled, smaller than the full smile in the cabin, but real. "Good night, Gideon. Good night, Josephine." He walked back to where Roper was tied and rode home through the June dark, feeling about 22 years old, which was not a feeling he had expected to have at 28, but which he was not, in any way, complaining about. The trouble with Harlan Rusk did not announce itself loudly when it arrived. It rarely did. It came in the form of a fence line dispute in mid-June, when two of Rusk's ranch hands appeared on the East Ridge and declared that the Bar 7's boundary extended 12 chains farther north than the current survey indicated, which would put a significant portion of Josephine's lower pasture and part of her creek access inside Bar 7 territory. She came to Gideon's ranch on a Sunday morning, which was the first time she had come to him rather than the other way around, and she had her survey papers and the deed under her arm and her jaw set in the particular way it set when she was managing something she was furious about without letting the fury get the better of her. He listened to the whole thing over the kitchen table and then went with her back to the ridge, and they walked the boundary lines together, comparing her survey papers against the landscape and the original stakes that her father had driven. The stakes were where they were supposed to be, consistent with the deed description, and bore no relation to the boundary the Rusk hands had described. They documented everything, both of them, Gideon writing notes in the pocket ledger he always carried and Josephine making her own precise record in the small bound book she used for ranch accounts. "He cannot legally move the line," Gideon said. "His survey and yours come from the same original federal land plat. If the plat says what your deed says, which it will, he has nothing." "I know that," she said. "What I need to know is whether he will try regardless." He was quiet for a moment. "Rusk is not a lawless man," he said, choosing his words carefully because it was a careful subject. "He is a man who has been accustomed to getting what he wants because he is the biggest operation in the county, and most people find it easier to accommodate him than to fight him. You are not most people, but he does not know that yet. He sent 2 men to tell me my land was not my land," she said flatly. "I think he has some sense of it." "Go to the sheriff," Gideon said. "File a formal complaint about the fence line dispute. Put it on paper. Rusk knows county records, and he knows that once something is on paper it becomes a different kind of problem." He paused. "And I will go with you if you want." She looked at him. "You do not need to." "I know I do not need to," he said. "I want to. I am also a property owner on this boundary, and I have an independent interest in correct survey lines being respected. My coming with you is not charity, Josephine. It is practical." She considered that and then nodded. "Tomorrow morning," she said. They went to the sheriff's office on Monday morning. Sheriff Amos Cole was a lean man of 55 who had been sheriff of Harlan Creek for 11 years, and who was, in Gideon's experience, a generally fair-minded man who could not always be counted on to go against Rusk directly, but who could absolutely be counted on to keep the law when the law was written down clearly in front of him. Josephine presented her complaint with every document she had, organized in the same careful sequence she had used with Walt Greer 2 months earlier. She was clear and specific and entirely unemotional in the delivery, and Gideon sat beside her and added his statement about the location of the original survey stakes, which he had witnessed independently. Cole filed the complaint, noted that Bar 7 would need to produce their own survey documentation to dispute the existing land plat, and said he would speak to Rusk. He was respectful to Josephine throughout, which Gideon noted and credited to the man, and when they walked out of the sheriff's office into the summer morning, Josephine let out a long, slow breath. "Good," she said, like a door shutting on a cold room. "He will back down," Gideon said. "Rusk is not going to pursue a line dispute against a documented federal homestead claim. The risk to his own title situation is too great." "I know," she said. "I am not worried about Rusk." She was quiet for a moment and then said, with a slight shift in her voice, "I am tired of having to fight for it." "I know," he said. "I have been fighting for it since November," she said. "The land office, the notary, the registry, and now this. It is mine. It is mine by law and by my father's work and by every right a person can have to a thing. And I am still standing here having to explain to one bureaucrat after another and one aggravating cattle baron after another that it is mine." She was not crying. She was not the kind of woman who cried on a public street and perhaps not anywhere. But she was, beneath the composed surface, genuinely weary, and he saw it and recognized it for what it was. Not weakness, but the particular exhaustion that comes from having to maintain sustained effort against sustained resistance when the effort should not have been necessary in the first place. He did something then that surprised both of them. He reached out and took her hand where it hung at her side, and he held it, just held it, standing on the wooden sidewalk of the main street of Harlan Creek in full view of anyone who happened to look out their window. It was a warm, steady, quiet gesture. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him. "You should not have to fight for it," he said, "but you are winning every fight. That is worth something." She turned her hand in his and held it back. They stood like that for a moment on the sunlit street, and whatever Harlan Creek thought about it, no one said anything to either of them about it, and that was perfectly fine. Rusk backed down. It took 2 weeks and a formal response from his own attorney, confirming that the Bar 7 survey did not support his hand's claimed boundary, but he backed down, and the fence line dispute was closed. He was cold toward both Josephine and Gideon at the cattle auction in July, which they attended together and sat together throughout. But cold was better than difficult, and they both ignored it with the practiced ease of people who have decided not to give a thing more energy than it deserves. The supper at the cabin in June had been the first of many. By July they had fallen into a natural rhythm that did not require much discussion. He came up the ridge most Saturdays. She came down to his ranch most Wednesday evenings, and they ate together and talked and sometimes worked on whatever needed doing in the long summer light. He met Pete properly for the first time, the old man having appeared from the kitchen when Josephine came down for the first Wednesday supper, with a look of frank assessment that made Gideon slightly nervous, and that Josephine apparently found entirely natural. She asked Pete about his joints, and he told her at length, and she told him about a treatment a doctor in Cheyenne had suggested that involved a particular kind of willow bark preparation, which Pete received with skepticism but polite interest. After she left that evening, Pete looked at Gideon across the kitchen and said, "She'll do," which from Pete was roughly equivalent to a canonization. Tamaz was quieter in his assessment, which was consistent with his general character, but Gideon noticed that when Josephine came to the ranch, Tamaz always found some small task to perform near whichever space she was working in, and he answered her questions about the horses with the particular attentiveness of someone who had decided the person asking was worth answering fully. Elias simply thought she was extraordinary and told Gideon so, ingenuously, one morning when Gideon was trying to concentrate on the ranch ledgers. Gideon told him to go check the water troughs and did not entirely succeed in not smiling. On a Thursday evening in late July, they were sitting on the steps of her cabin as the sun went down behind the western ridge, the sky going from orange to deep rose to the particular purple that came just before the stars, and she said, out of no particular preceding conversation, "How long has the Covington ranch been in your family?" "My father filed on it in 1858, he said. "He built the house the year before I was born, which was 1850. He paused, realizing the arithmetic did not work. He built the main structure in 1858 and added the rest later. I was born in Omaha, actually. We came out here when I was 8. "And your mother," she said. "She died when I was 17, he said. "Fever, she was from Virginia originally, like I said. I think she was happy here by the end. It took her some years to love this landscape. She called it bleak when we first arrived." He smiled at the memory. "She was wrong about that eventually." "It is not bleak," Josephine agreed, looking out at the ridgeline where the last orange light was going. "And your mother?" he asked. "She died when I was 12, Josephine said. "I barely remember her clearly. She was soft and she smelled like lavender and she sang in a low voice when she thought no one could hear her." She paused. "After she died, it was just my father and me. He was a good man, a very good man." She was quiet a moment. "He would have liked you." The simplicity of it hit him harder than any elaborate statement would have. He looked at her profile in the fading light, the clean line of her jaw with the scar that he had stopped seeing as a separate thing, and simply saw as part of her face, the way you stop seeing any particular feature of a person you know well and instead see them whole. He had known her for 4 months. It felt like longer. It felt in the way that some things feel, like something that had always been coming toward him from a great distance and had simply now arrived. "Josephine," he said. She turned and looked at him, and he saw in her eyes that she already knew what he was going to say, and that she had been waiting for him to say it with a patience equal to his own. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for a while. I wanted to tell you honestly and not make a performance of it, and so I am telling you on a Thursday evening on your front steps, which is perhaps not the most dramatic setting, but it is an honest one." She looked at him for a long moment. The sky was deep purple now and the first stars were beginning. "I know," she said softly. "I am not asking you for anything in return," he said. "I know that is not. I know trust takes time. I know you have reasons to move slowly and I respect every one of them." "Gideon," she said, and there was something in the way she said his name, an ease and a warmth and a certainty that had not been there in April when she had shaken his hand in Walt Greer's office. "Yes," he said. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to decide whether to tell you for several weeks." She paused. "I kept finding reasons why it was too soon or too uncertain or too." She shook her head slightly. "I am a very practical woman and practicality is sometimes a way of avoiding things." He reached out slowly, giving her time to see it coming, and took her face in both his hands, and she let him. And he kissed her in the last of the light before the stars, on the steps of her own cabin on her own land. And she kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything, completely and without reservation. And it was exactly what both of them had been waiting for without having known they were waiting. They sat on the steps for a long time after that, her shoulder against his, watching the stars come out over the dark shape of the ridge, and talked about nothing in particular and everything in general. And it was the finest evening that either of them could recall in a long time. August was a warm and full month on both properties, the kind of productive summer that Wyoming delivered in the years when the rain was adequate and the grass held and the market prices cooperated. Josephine's small herd was healthy, and she sold 3 steers at the August cattle market for a fair price, enough to buy additional supplies and commission a small addition to the cabin. a proper back room for storage, and a covered porch along the south side that would give her shade through the heat of summer afternoons. Gideon helped her plan it, and they spent 2 weekends building it together, along with Tamaz and Elias, who appeared on both occasions with tools and lumber, and the comfortable efficiency of ranch hands who had decided this was a project worth their time. It was during the second weekend of building, on a Sunday when the porch frame was going up, and Josephine was measuring and calling measurements, and Gideon was cutting, and he was aware at every moment of her presence, the sound of her voice and the way she moved, and the small private smile she had developed specifically for him, a smile that was different from the rare public smile, more open and more real. It was during this that Marta Voss arrived on horseback from town, which was unusual enough that everyone stopped what they were doing. She had a letter. It had come to the post office addressed to Josephine Hayes, and the postmark was from a law firm in Cheyenne, and Marta, who had developed something of a protective feeling toward her quiet tenant, had ridden the 5 miles up to the ridge rather than leave it in the box. Josephine wiped her hands on her canvas work trousers and took the letter and read it, standing in the summer sun with no particular expression while she read. Then she folded it and looked up. "Well," she said, "what is it?" Gideon asked. "My father had a small savings deposit with a bank in Cheyenne," she said. "The bank was in the process of closing when he died, and the accounts went into an estate process." She paused. "It appears the estate has been settled. There is a sum of $342 waiting for me to collect." A silence, and then Tamaz let out a low sound of appreciation, and Elias said, "That is a fortune," and Marta said, "Good. That man worked hard for it," meaning Samuel Hayes, and Josephine looked at Gideon across the unfinished porch frame. He was watching her with the expression he sometimes had when something moved him, and he was not going to make a ceremony of it, but was also not going to pretend it had not. "Your father took care of you," he said quietly. She looked at the letter for a moment. "He took care of me his whole life," she said, "even after he was gone." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright, and she blinked once, deliberately. "All right," she said, and put the letter in her coat pocket. "Let us get this porch finished." They got it finished. In September, Gideon asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically or with elaborate preparation. He did it on a Wednesday evening at his kitchen table, after supper, with Pete having gone to his room early in the particular pointed way that suggested the old man had been waiting for this evening for some time. They were sitting across from each other with the remnants of the meal between them and the lamp making the kitchen warm and amber, and Gideon put both his hands flat on the table and said, "I want to marry you. I want you to be my wife, and I want to spend every day being your husband, and I know this is your land and your life, and I am not asking you to give any of that up. I am asking you to add to it." She looked at him for a long moment. She had been looking at this moment coming toward her for several weeks, had been living with the knowledge of it the way she lived with most anticipated things, steadily and without panic, checking it from all sides. "You understand," she said carefully, "that the cabin and the parcel remain mine, in my name." "Obviously," he said, with a certainty that required no elaboration, "and that I intend to keep running my herd as its own operation, not folded into the Covington brand." "Josephine," he said, "I would not dream of suggesting otherwise. And that I am not gentle or particularly easily managed, and that I have opinions about nearly everything." "I am aware," he said, and there was the deep, warm affection of someone who has catalogued every one of those opinions with great enjoyment. "It is one of the most significant reasons I want to marry you." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she reached across the table and put her hands over his. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes. I have been wanting to say yes for 2 months. Then why?" he started. "Because I wanted to make sure you were asking me the right question," she said, "and not a different version of it." He understood what she meant, and he understood why she needed to know the difference. "The right question," he said. "Yes," she said, "the right question." He stood up from the table and came around it, and she stood, and he put his arms around her, and she put hers around him, and they stood in the warm kitchen in the September dark, and held each other for a long time without saying anything else, because everything important had already been said and both of them knew it. They were married in October, on a clear Saturday morning when the aspen on the ridge had gone gold, in a small ceremony at the Harlan Creek church that was attended by most of the town, because Harlan Creek was 400 people, and this was interesting to nearly all of them. Marta Voss sat in the front pew and wept silently and dignifiedly. Pete wore his good jacket and looked as proud as if he had arranged the whole thing himself. Tomas stood at the back of the church with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who is satisfied with how things have worked out. Elias was Gideon's witness and was moved to an extent he would later deny. Walt Greer attended and looked somewhat pleased with himself, as though he had played a greater role in proceedings than was perhaps accurate. Ada Prout from the general store attended and said afterward to Clara Watkins that it had been the finest wedding the town had seen in years. Old Ruth Calloway attended and said it was about time and that she had known from the first Tuesday morning. Josephine wore a dark blue dress that she had ordered from a dressmaker in Douglas and that fit her precisely, and which she wore with the same straight-backed quality that she wore everything. And when she walked up the aisle she walked alone, which she had chosen deliberately, because she had gotten herself here, and it was right that she should arrive under her own authority. She carried a small bunch of the late autumn wildflowers that still bloomed in the sheltered hollows of the East Ridge, goldenrod and wild aster, and the last of the blue chicory. Gideon was waiting at the front of the church, and when he saw her come through the door, the expression on his face was the kind that people remember when they tell the story of a wedding years later. It was not complicated. It was simply a man looking at the person he loved, fully and without reservation, in front of everyone. She walked up the aisle to him, and he took her hand, and they stood together before the minister. And when the minister asked the required questions, both of them answered with complete certainty. No hesitation, no formality of doubt, just the plain, clear yes of two people who have thought it through and arrived here with their whole attention. They put on the rings they had chosen, simple gold bands, Josephine slightly narrower and engraved inside with the date. He had not told her about the engraving. She felt it with her thumb after the ring was on and looked down and then looked up at him with an expression that was unguarded in a way she rarely permitted in public, open and warm and deeply glad. And he smiled at her with a smile she had never seen from him before, wider and less restrained than his usual expressions, and the church seemed to hold its breath for a moment. They were both, for the record, 28 and 25 years old when they married, which placed them firmly in the range of adults who had seen enough of the world to know what they were choosing and why. The wedding supper was held at the Elkhorn restaurant, which cleared its back room for the occasion, and ran until late in the evening with good food and music from a fiddler named Marsh, who played everything from hymns to dance tunes with equal enthusiasm. Gideon danced with Josephine in the small cleared space in the center of the room and held her properly and moved well, which surprised her. She had not known he could dance, and she told him so, and he said his mother had made him learn, which she said she would have to remember to thank his mother for. He laughed and spun her, and she laughed in return, fully and openly, the way she was learning to laugh with him, without the small holding back that had been second nature for so long. They rode home together that night, up the eastern road and then up the ridge, in the cold, clear October dark with the stars brilliant overhead and the gold of the aspen gone to shadow. They had decided they would split their time between both properties as needed, which was practical and also felt right, because the cabin on the ridge and the ranch house in the valley were both their home now, in the way that things become yours through love rather than through mere possession. The first winter of their marriage was a good one, in the way that first winters can be good hard in the practical sense, cold in the particular bone-deep way of Wyoming winters, with heavy snowfall in November that kept them close to the ranch house for stretches of days and cut off the easy travel between properties. They were mostly at the ranch house, because it was larger and better heated for winter, and Josephine went up to check the cabin and the small herd on the ridge every few days when the snow allowed, usually with Gideon or Tamaz riding alongside. They read together in the evenings, which was perhaps the most domestic and also one of the most satisfying things either of them had discovered about sharing a life. The quiet company of two people reading in the same room, the occasional observation read aloud, the conversation that grew from a single sentence encountered in a book and went wherever it went. He had a good library, for a ranch house in Wyoming in 1878, built from his mother's books and his own additions over the years, and she brought her own small collection. 6 books carefully kept through all the moves from city to city, including a battered copy of David Copperfield that her father had given her when she was 12, and that was missing its title page and half of the back cover. She discovered, that winter, the man beneath the capable and steady exterior she had first encountered on the fence line. He was funny, in an understated way, the kind of humor that required attention to catch, and once she had caught it, she found it everywhere. He was also in the private space of their shared life, tender in a way that she had not expected, and that did not embarrass him and did not embarrass her. A simple and uncomplicated tenderness that felt like the most natural thing in the world, and that she settled into with the ease of something found rather than built. She told him things that winter that she had not told anyone in years. Not dramatic things, not the old injuries, those had already been spoken, but small things, the things she had wanted when she was young, the specific texture of the years of moving, the particular loneliness of being excellent at the work you do, and having no one to share the satisfaction of it with. He listened to all of it with the full attention he gave to everything she said, and he told her things in return, things about the years after his father died when the ranch had felt like a weight and a responsibility, and not yet like a home, and about the long years of running it alone when it had been practical and successful, but had also been, underneath, something that was missing its other half. By February she knew she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning over breakfast with the particular directness she brought to every significant announcement, and he put down his coffee cup and looked at her, and then got up and came around the table and pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that was the most emotion she had ever seen him express in a physical way. And she held on to him and felt the deep, real happiness of it settle into her like warmth. Pete wept when they told him, openly and without apology, which he explained was because he had been waiting 28 years for this ranch to have a child in it again, and he was not going to pretend he had not been. Tamaz shook Gideon's hand and then turned to Josephine and bowed slightly, which was his particular formal acknowledgement of something important. Elias said, "Oh," several times and then turned bright red and congratulated them both with great sincerity. She kept working through the spring. This was not negotiable, and she made that clear to Gideon early, who said he was not suggesting otherwise and who proved it by not suggesting otherwise. Not once. Through the whole spring and into the summer when the heat came back and the baby was growing, and she was managing her herd on the ridge and helping with the Covington cattle, and also somehow keeping the accounts for both operations in the small bound books that had multiplied, and were now stacked on a shelf in the ranch house kitchen alongside the pots and the jars of preserves. She also, in the spring, made a trip to Cheyenne. She took the train from Douglas, spent 3 days, and came back having collected her father's $342 from the bank estate, having visited her father's grave in the Cheyenne cemetery, and left the last of the wild asters from the ridge, having filed the completed transfer of the East Ridge parcel into her married name at the Federal Land Office without incident, and having purchased 3 additional books. one of which was a medical reference text that she installed next to the first aid kit in the ranch house, because she felt it was a reasonable addition to any household in a territory where the nearest doctor was 40 miles away. Gideon met her at the Douglas station and drove her home in the wagon, and on the drive she told him about the cemetery, and he reached over and took her hand on the wagon seat without saying anything, and she held it and looked at the landscape coming toward them in the afternoon light, the familiar lines of the hills and the beginning of the red dust flats, and beyond them the suggestion of the ridge. And she thought about her father who had come out here in his 50s looking for something, and found it, and left it to her, and she thought that he would have had things to say about this particular April afternoon, driving home through the Wyoming landscape with his daughter's hand held in. A good man's hand, and most of those things would have made him very happy. The baby came in late August at the ranch house, with the help of Mrs. Clara Watkins, who turned out to have considerable practical midwifery experience despite her ministerial wife exterior, and Marta Voss, who had driven out from town, and who was in the kitchen making enough food for an army. Gideon was outside. He had been told to be outside. He had obeyed this instruction with tremendous difficulty, and had spent the better part of the night sitting on the porch steps, which was not so different from sitting with Josephine on her cabin steps in July of the previous year, except that currently his hands would not be still, and he could not have told you what the stars looked like despite having stared at them for hours. When Clara Watkins opened the front door and told him he had a son, and that Josephine was well and asking for him, he went inside with a speed that was not strictly dignified, and did not care even slightly. She was sitting up in the bed, tired in the way of someone who has done something large but fully present and fully herself, with the particular clarity she always had in her eyes and the small private smile she kept for him. The baby was in her arms. He was red and small and had a look of furious concentration on his face that Gideon recognized, privately and immediately, as his wife's. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then looked at Josephine. "Samuel," she said. "For my father, if you agree." "Samuel Covington," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "Yes, of course." She looked at him in the lamplight with the new baby in her arms, and he looked at her. And it was one of those moments that does not require any words and is not made better by them. So he simply reached out and touched her face gently, his thumb along the line of her jaw, along the scar, and she leaned into his hand the way she had been leaning into him for a year now, with complete and unguarded trust, and the baby made a small sound and both of them looked at him. "Hello, Samuel," she said softly. Pete was beside himself. He spent the better part of a week finding reasons to be in whatever room the baby was in, and developed, within the first month, a repertoire of songs and faces and low-voiced conversations with the infant that were entirely unrelated to his previous personality, and that nobody mentioned because it would have embarrassed him, and because they were also deeply charming. Tamaz carved a small wooden horse, which he left without ceremony on the window ledge of the room where Samuel slept. Elias asked if he could hold the baby, and then held him with such terrified care that Josephine took pity on him and told him to relax, that babies were sturdier than they looked, which helped. The autumn and the following winter were full ones, 2 operations running, a new baby, and the particular richness of days that are demanding and satisfying in equal measure. Josephine's herd on the ridge had grown to 28 head by October, and she had made a deal with a buyer in Douglas for the spring sale that she considered highly favorable. The Covington ranch had a good cattle year, and Gideon bought out the southern pasture that had been leased since his father's time, bringing the total acreage of the Covington operation to 680 acres. Together with the East Ridge parcel, they were running close to 900 acres of productive ranch land in the Harlan Creek foothills. They hired a second ranch hand in the spring, a quiet Comanche man named James Nightbird, who had been displaced from his land in the Indian Territory by the same relentless series of policies that had stripped his people of the treaty rights they had been guaranteed. and who had come north looking for work with a skill set that made him one of the finest horsemen and cattle handlers Gideon had ever employed. He was treated exactly as Tamaz and Elias were treated, with respect and fair pay and a bunk in the bunkhouse, and a place at the table when the hands ate together. And if anyone in Harlan Creek had an opinion about this, they did not say it where either Josephine or Gideon could hear it, which Josephine considered a satisfactory outcome, if not an entirely just one. She and Nightbird talked sometimes in the evenings when the work was done, with the directness that she had found was common between people who had both been required to fight for the most basic acknowledgement of their rights. He told her about the territory, and she listened with the full attention she gave to things that mattered. She said once that she wished the law was more just, and he said, with a dry brevity that she respected, that wishing and working were different activities, and he had made his peace with which one was useful. She said she had made the same peace, and meant it, and there was a real understanding between them from that point forward that was one of the quiet good things about the ranch. By the following summer, with Samuel walking and saying a few words, and exhibiting the combined determination of both his parents in every endeavor from eating to standing upright, Josephine knew she was expecting again. She told Gideon in the same direct Tuesday morning way, and he responded with the same fierceness, and there was additional weeping from Pete, whose emotional responses to family events had by this point become entirely predictable and entirely welcome. The second child was a girl. She came in the spring of 1881, and she was named Eliza Ruth, Ruth being for old Ruth Calloway, who had died the previous December at the age of 83, and who had, in her last year, become something of an adopted grandmother to the household, coming out to the ranch on Sundays when her health allowed and sitting on the porch and watching Samuel with an expression of deep satisfaction. Josephine had sat with her in her last weeks and had been holding her hand when she died, which Ruth had apparently known would be the case because she had said, 2 days before, "I am glad you rode in on that Tuesday, girl," which Josephine had understood to mean what it meant and had said, "So am I." Eliza Ruth Covington was born in April with very little drama, and immediately began to make up for the lack of drama by being the loudest and most opinionated person in any room she occupied. A quality that Gideon found entirely hilarious and that Josephine found both familiar and appropriate. The ranch grew. The family grew. The years between 1878 and 1885 built themselves into something real and lasting, a life that had been made from 2 people's worth of determination and practical skill, and the particular good fortune of having found each other on a Tuesday morning in a registry office in Wyoming. They worked hard and they argued sometimes, because they were both people who had strong opinions and were not afraid to express them, and the arguments were honest and were always resolved, because both of them had decided that they were too practical to waste energy on unresolved grievances. They built the covered porch on the ranch house that they had been talking about since the first winter. Josephine eventually yielded to the suggestion of a separate office space in the ranch house for the account books, which became, in practice, a small room with a desk and the growing library and a view of the eastern ridge, which she could see from the window on clear days, the dark line of the tree tops and above them the sky, which was always changing and always enormous. Marta Voss came out for Sunday suppers through the years and ate and talked and declined dessert, and then always had dessert anyway and pretended not to notice that Josephine noticed. Walt Greer retired from the registry office and was replaced by a younger man who was somewhat more efficient but less interesting. Harlan Rusk's Bar 7 operation went through several bad years in the early 1880s due to drought and poor management of the water access he had been so eager to secure, and he eventually sold the eastern portion of his holdings and moved his operation to the northern part of the county, which suited everyone on the eastern ridge tolerably well. Elias got married in 1883 to a girl from Casper who came to visit her cousins in Harlan Creek and met Elias at a dance and had apparently decided he was worth staying for. He moved off the Covington ranch at that point and started a small operation of his own north of town, but he came back to help with the roundups and the big fence repairs, and his wife Nora, who was practical and cheerful and thought Josephine was everything she aspired to be, became one of Josephine's closest friends in the county. Tamaz stayed. He was simply part of the ranch, the way the land was part of the ranch, and he would probably have been insulted by any suggestion that he might do anything else. James Nightbird stayed too, and became in time the sort of man whom the other hands deferred to on questions of horses and cattle without it ever needing to be formally decided, and who in the evenings sometimes sat on the bunkhouse step and played a wooden flute in the old way, and the sound of it came through the dusk to the ranch house porch where Gideon and Josephine sometimes sat after the children were in bed, and it was simply part of the sound of the place, the way all the sounds were. The cattle in the pasture and the creek in the distance, and the wind off the ridge, and the enormous Wyoming sky going to dark and stars. Pete died in the spring of 1884, quietly in his room in the ranch house, in his sleep. He was 71 or thereabouts. Nobody had ever been entirely certain of his exact age. Gideon buried him on the property, on the low hill that looked east toward the ridge, which Pete had always said had the best view on the entire ranch. Josephine planted a rosebush by the marker, a hardy climber that came back every year with small fierce red flowers, and Samuel, who was 5 and had loved Pete with the complete uncomplicated love of small children for the elderly people in their lives who have all the time in the world for them, put a handful of polished creek stones at the base of the marker, which stayed there through every winter, and were always replaced when they were washed away. In the autumn of 1885, when Samuel was 6 and Eliza Ruth was 4, and the ranch had found its deep rhythm, and the 2 operations on the East Ridge and in the valley were doing well, and the accounts were in a comfortable state, and Harlan Creek had settled into its general contentment with itself, Gideon found Josephine on the porch one evening after supper, sitting in the last of the light, watching the ridge. He came and sat beside her, the way he had sat beside her in 100 different evenings over 7 years. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She turned and looked at him. She was 32 years old now, and the years had not so much changed her as deepened her, the way a landscape deepens as you learn it. The scar along her jaw had faded to a thin silver line, something you noticed only in certain lights, and she wore it the way she had always worn it, without apology and without display, simply as a part of herself. Her dark eyes were the same as they had always been, attentive and still and warm underneath. She was, he thought, the most beautiful person he had ever seen, which was not about the way she looked so much as it was about everything that looking at her contained. All the Tuesdays and Saturdays and Wednesday evenings, and the coffee on the front steps, and the arguments and the laughter and the mornings, and the long quiet nights, and 2 small people who had her determination and his patience, and were going to be thoroughly incapable of being managed by anyone. "I was thinking," she said, "that my father would be very pleased." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, and they looked at the ridge going dark in the evening light. "What would he say?" Gideon asked. She was quiet for a moment. "He would say," she said, and her voice was gentle and sure, "that a deed in a boot is a good beginning, and that everything after that is the story." He held her closer. She put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder. The ridge went from copper to shadow. Somewhere in the house, Samuel's voice rose and then fell in whatever small drama was occupying him this evening, and Eliza Ruth answered him with her characteristic decisive authority, and neither of them moved because there was no reason to, because they were exactly where they had each, separately and then together, been working their whole lives to arrive. The stars came out over the Wyoming ridge, one and then many and then the full brilliant sweep of them, and the night settled in warm and full over the East Ridge parcel, and the Valley Ranch, and the two operations that were one life. And the creek ran on in the dark below, and everything was resolved and everything was right. And the story that the scar and the deed had begun on a Tuesday morning in 1878 had become, over the years, something far larger and far more complete than either one of them had dared to imagine when they stood in Walt Greer's small, dusty office and shook hands for the first time. It had become a home. It had become a family. It had become, most simply and most truly, the thing that Josephine Hayes had been carrying in her boot all along, not just the deed to a piece of land on a Wyoming ridge, but the possibility of something worth fighting for, worth arriving for, worth the long, hard road and every obstacle along it. And it had become, for Gideon Covington, the answer to the particular question that a man does not know he has been waiting to ask until the morning a gray mare ties up outside the registry office, and the woman who climbs down from the saddle looks at his town like something she intends to deal with, and meets his eyes for exactly one moment in the doorway, and tells him, a few hours later, standing at a property stake near a split-top pine on a Wyoming ridge, that they are neighbors. They were more than neighbors. They always had been, from the beginning, in all the ways that mattered, and they were that now, and they would be that through every season that followed, through every difficult year and every good one, through the growth of the ranch and the growth of the family and the long, beautiful, ordinary days of a life built from honesty and hard work, and the particular courage of two people who had each arrived at the edge of something unknown and stepped forward anyway. The evening was full and warm and complete, and the stars were very bright, and there was nothing left undone.